This review is of a Liebherr LTM 1250 mobile crane, and it's been produced by NZG Models. Inside the Liebherr branded box there are polystyrene trays, and in the top there are some parts, and you can see that they're all nicely wrapped. And if we then carry on and cut our way through to the bottom tray, once again lots of soft paper has been used to protect the model. Included is a nice quality instruction manual, and that clearly shows all of the parts in the box. And then through various drawings the main features of the model are described. These instructions are largely pictorial, and they describe the main features of the crane. Also included are some reeving diagrams. To begin with, as we usually do, we'll put the crane into road-going mode. And we'll start with the outriggers because they are pinned in an operating position, and you have to forcibly remove the pin to get the transport position. The manual suggests these pins should come as separate parts rather than being fixed as they are on the model, and that's probably because once the pins are removed, they are quite a loose fit when you put them back. So there we have the pad in the offset transport position, so when we push it back under the carrier it doesn't stick out. The next job is to unravel some rope from the winch drum, and then we can run that forward so we can attach a hook block, and with the magic that is cranes etc, here it is already reeved on. For transport you want to tie the hook on at the front, but sadly the hitch hasn't been modelled to allow this, so here we've just roughly attached some chain onto the number plate. One thing you notice straight away is that the sheaves in the boom head are on sliding axles, and they can actually slide out of the boom head. It seems to have been done this way to replicate the attachment points for the fly jib on the boom head of the real crane, but it would have been nicer if these axles couldn't slide out so easily. Moving on to the fly jib, and it comes in 3 sections which are all made of metal, and you join the pieces together using tiny nuts and bolts. This is a system used by NZG many times before, and special tools are provided to help you handle the very small parts. The tools work well as long as there's enough space to actually get them in the various parts of the model, and in some places that's just a little bit difficult. But they do give the model a nice feel of precision engineering rather than using plastic bolts. Out of the box the parts have a guide pulley which is in the raised position, but for the transport mode you need to unbolt it so it can be lowered. To get the fly jib on the side of the boom there are 3 plastic clips which just drop into place. And the biggest one goes at the front, and the smallest one goes at the back. Once the hangers are in, you can then place the fly jib in position. And that's fairly straightforward, but you might need to just manoeuvre it about a bit to get it in the right position. So the crane is ready for the road. Let's take a look at the counterweight. And it's one of the more complicated counterweights that you'll see on a crane model. And that's because it's made up of a large number of different shaped pieces. But fortunately the instruction manual is good at explaining which piece goes where. And if you'd like to test yourself, you could try and build this as a blindfold challenge. And if you do it as a blindfold challenge, please post a video on YouTube so we can all see how stupid you look. Once you've fully assembled the counterweight, you end up with a nice solid chunk of metal. To go with the crane we need a truck to transport the counterweight, so let's load up a big ballast carrier. The detailing under the carrier is very good with the suspension and transmission modelled, although some of the drive shafts stop short and don't actually link up between the axles. There's also some other details such as the tanks at the rear. The wheels have different hubs depending on whether they are driven axles or not, and there are nice small details such as steps and door handles, and one area of high detail is the many tiny graphics. The exhaust stack has a nice mesh finish, and the detail along the carrier deck is also convincing, with a nice touch being the flexible rubber skirts above the wheels. Again, there are more tiny graphics around the crane cab, but both the mirror and the grab rails are plastic. Looking closely towards the back, there are many more tiny graphics. The crane superstructure is fairly simple, and that's because there's no engine in the crane, with the whole machine being driven by a single engine on the carrier. The hydraulic ram jacket is a little unusual for a new crane model because it is plastic, but it has an excellent colour match. The boom sections are all nicely modelled in metal, and the hook blocks are metal too. And all of the sheaves on the model are also metal. The fly jib is also a nicely engineered part, nearly all in metal. We start with the crane on its back so we can tickle its belly, and it's nice and spongy with each of the axles having its own independent sprung suspension. The steering on the model is also very good with each axle having its own independent steering. The range of movement is good and you can set any steering mode that you want. The model is die-cast metal and heavy, but it springs nicely on its suspension, although the review model seems to sit a little high at the rear end. The heavy weight of the model also helps it to roll along nice and smoothly, and it also performs very well if you set the steering, and that's because the stiffness of the steering is just right, so the axles don't wobble about when you drive the crane along. Okay, that's enough driving about, so let's get on site and set the crane up. The outriggers have metal beams and they're two-stage, and as usual the pads are lowered by unscrewing them. It's been properly engineered with smooth pistons appearing and no ugly screw threads. One thing the model does lack though is spreader plates, and they are a good idea because when extended the pistons are at the limit of their range. The ones used here are not included with the model and they are NZG part number 787. Using the plates the model can be held wheels free, and the outrigger beams have a decent profile. We move on and use the giant hand to disconnect the hook block, and because we're now on site we can raise the handrails from their transport position. There's also an additional set of handrail that just presses into place at the back of the crane. Raising the boom does require a little effort, largely due to the plastic nature of the cylinder jacket, but there is also a locking system because you can use a key on a tiny grub screw at the top of the jacket. That can be tightened up to give a firm grip and hold a pose, but looking at the manual maybe this is intended to be done at certain positions where the piston is flattened out. With the boom up we can get into some serious hook action, and a key is provided to operate the winch drum, and actually it's a nice winch drum to use. It's got a positive action brake and it's nicely spring loaded. Moving on to rotation, and that works well enough with no rocking or rolling, but overall it was quite stiff on the review model. Another smaller feature is that the cab can be tilted. The counterweight mechanism on this crane is interesting, and there are two small stops that can be raised up. They indicate the position of the first piece of counterweight when it's on the carrier deck, and the interesting thing is that this crane has what's called VarioBallast. So the counterweight can be positioned close in as you see here, and that's used when space is tight when the crane is turning. But there's an alternative to obtain maximum lifting capacity, and to do that you rotate out the two attachment points, and by lowering the two stops we saw earlier you can reposition the counterweight accordingly. The method of attaching the ballast is also very good because it tries to replicate the real crane, and using the supplied key you can unscrew and lower the attachment points. Once you've got them lowered enough you can then hook them into the counterweight, and after that you can reverse the process. You turn the key and lift up the counterweight. Once the counterweight is lifted, you can rotate the crane and it can go into action. Here's a different angle to show how the VarioBallast works. And if you want, it is possible to show less than the full counterweight block, but you can only really do this by balancing the counterweight rather than securing it in position. Moving on to the telescopic boom, and it's got the realistic feature of locking points at various extensions, and they apply to each part of the telescope. The telescopic sections all extend smoothly and they maintain a good profile. If you want to go for the maximum height, you need to add on the fly jib, and you start by bolting up the swing away section and raising out the guide pulley. The fly jib then slots over the attachment points that are on the axles at the boom head, and you secure it on by tiny brass nuts and bolts, although the clearances are tight, making the use of the tools a bit more difficult. Once you've got it attached, there is another possibility, which is to set it at different offset angles. You can set it straight or at one of two angles, and you secure it in position again with a brass nut and bolt. Fully extended, this is quite a big model, so let's go ahead and do a dim check. And at maximum extension on the main boom, you reach a height of about 120 centimeters or nearly 48 inches. If you add on the fly jib, you then get to 160 centimeters or about 63 inches. NZG set a very high standard with its previous LTM 11200 crane model, and this one also sets a high standard. There are more tiny graphics adding detail, the VarioBallast is implemented nicely, but the model does really require some spreader plates. Overall though, it's good enough to rate as excellent.